What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are covering night terrors. Now, this story basically opens up with Batman being choked to death. But there is something to explain here about night terrors. The idea behind this story is that the guy here who's choking Batman, this is a new villain being introduced to us known as Insomnia. This guy has the ability to alter reality in such a way to where he can take, at least on some level, people's nightmares and bring them into the real world. Now, he is hunting for an artifact that will allow him to do that on seemingly a universal scale and make him more powerful than anything we've ever seen before. And we'll talk about what that artifact is here in a little bit. But this version of Batman that you see is Batman, but it's not Batman. One of the things that Insomnia had done when he entered into the world is he initiated something called the Nightmare Wave. Basically, anybody who was already asleep at that point in time was sort of thrust into their worst nightmares and is just reliving them over and over again. So for those of you guys who are familiar with Marvel Comics, this guy's basically just Nightmare from Marvel. That's really all he is. But the thing about this is that Batman, despite the fact that he's being choked by Insomnia, is actually asleep. What's really happening here is he's currently possessed by a guy named Boston Brand, also known as Deadman. Now, Deadman is basically a kind of specter that floats around the world. He inhabits the bodies of people, sometimes out of curiosity just to see what their lives are like, other times because he has to communicate a message to all the superheroes who are out there. One of the things that had taken place leading up to this in a story called Night Terror's First Blood was basically when Insomnia made his move, Boston Brand possessed Batman, tried to warn Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman, but it was simply just too late, and they were ultimately trapped in their own mental state, and that was basically it. And so what Boston Brand does is he actually leaves the body of Batman and then enters into the body of Insomnia, because from his perspective, he wants to know what this guy's about. That when he asks him, what's your whole spiel? The response of Insomnia is, I'm the literal god of nightmares. Now, here's what's so cool about this, that what happens is once Boston Brand enters into the body and really the mind of Insomnia, he starts looking through everything and he realizes this guy's hunting for something called the Nightmare Stone. Now, what's the Nightmare Stone? The Nightmare Stone is actually a modified version of what's called the Dream Stone. What's the Dream Stone? So in DC Comics, the Dream Stone is an artifact that was created by what you and I would call a cosmic entity known as Dream of the Endless, and that anybody who possesses the Dream Stone, if they have the wherewithal to do it, can channel the dreams of everybody in the world who's sleeping and then turn those dreams into physical manifestations, essentially altering reality. Now, what had actually happened here is that somewhere along the line, the Dream Stone was taken by Dr. Destiny and then eventually a guy named John D, and it was perverted and twisted and turned into a Nightmare Stone. So in effect, it does the exact same thing the Dream Stone does. The difference is that it feeds on nightmares instead of dreams. And so that's exactly what Insomnia is hunting for. If he attains this, he'd basically be able to keep the world in perpetual sleep and presumably even be able to take over the entirety of the universe, because virtually every organism in existence has to sleep at some point. Now, the other thing that Boston Brand realizes in scanning this guy's mind is he ends up coming across Arkham Tower. And that's when he realizes this god of nightmares is not a god at all. He's just a guy. And in fact, somewhere along the line, this guy was exposed to the Lazarus Rain. Now, in DC Comics, there was a story that took place relatively recently called Lazarus Planet. And that in DC Comics, you have something called the Lazarus Pit, which is basically a giant liquid whereby if you're severely injured and sometimes even dead, you can be put inside that Lazarus Pit and you'll come back. You'll experience temporary insanity, but eventually you'll regain your composure. During the events of Lazarus Planet, what had happened is that the Lazarus resin or the Lazarus Pit, whatever you want to call it, within a volcano, that substance had basically been exposed to the helmet of Dr. Fate. And when that happened, it imbued the rain with magical properties. Why does that matter? Because DC basically used it as a way to bring back superheroes who were dead. So when a person is exposed to the Lazarus resin, they're not truly alive, but they're not truly dead. They're not quite a zombie. They're just kind of somewhere in between. But for some people, it gave them powers. In this instance, it gave this guy the ability to at least take people's nightmares on some level and manifest manifest them in the physical world. But once he gets the Nightmare Stone, assuming that he actually does, he would become almost godly in terms of power. Now, one of the other things that Boston Brand realizes is that this guy is basically taking his happy memories and like keeping them hidden away. We don't really know why, but basically he's shutting off that part of himself that is loving, caring, and compassionate. Now, eventually Boston Brand is expelled out of the body of Insomnia. Now, this is not really uncommon in the sense that if a person has enough fortitude or they have enough mental control, they can force Boston Brand out of their own body. But Boston Brand realizes this guy's just a dude, and there's no real reason to concern himself with this dude in particular, like to hang around here and just kind of see what happens. And so he basically ends up fleeing the entire building. Now, one of the things that Insomnia hits at is that when he's in this place, which is to say, when he's in the real world, the reality is that his power begins to kind of dwindle. So he's very similar to Mephisto from Marvel Comics, right? The longer Mephisto is away from his own realm, the weaker he becomes. It's the same thing here. So this guy ends up having to teleport back to the Nightmare realm, but basically brings out a few of his henchmen to try to track down Boston Brand in the body of Batman in order to capture him. And the reason for this is because Boston Brand comes to the realization that even if he doesn't necessarily know where the Nightmare Stone is, and essentially no one knows where it is, he does believe he knows of a guy who has long since been dead that may very well know where the stone is actually located. So jumping out of a building and basically using like these weird, wild looking twisted vines where the whole earth is basically being mutated, and then getting down into the Batmobile and taking off, this guy heads to a graveyard. And one of the coolest things about this is what this guy's actually doing, because something to understand, not everyone in the world is asleep, right? People don't all go to sleep in the world at the same time. So you do have characters like Red Tornado, who doesn't really sleep because he's basically a robot. You've got Zatanna, who's just a really powerful magic wielder. You've got people out there who are trying to understand who this Insomnia guy is and trying to find some way to defeat him. But once Boston Brand gets to this graveyard, what he says is this guy here has long since been dead, and that while the Lazarus Rain had basically been wiped away from pretty much the entirety of the earth, Batman, ever the guy who's preparing for everything, had kept some of the vials within the Batcave. And so what Boston Brand did is he grabbed the vials, took them to the graveyard, and then poured them all over this grave after partially digging it up. And what it does is it brings this guy kind of back from the dead, only for us to find out it's Wesley Dodds. It's the Sandman. Now, why does that matter? Because Sandman has a very close history with Dream of the Endless, so much so that in the early days of his publication history, the two of them had met, and because of his encounter with Dream, he actually had these kind of prophetic visions. For those of you guys who ever read Kingdom Come, if you were wondering how it was that like Sandman would have these visions of like war in the future and all that kind of stuff, right? The superhero civil war in DC Comics, that was because of his encounter with the Endless, right? That's the power that he has. But more so than that, because Wesley Dodds and because Dream were so closely knit, right? So close to each other, if anyone in the world would know where the Nightmare Stone is, because it's basically a mutated version of the Dream Stone, it would be Wesley. So this is cool. It's exciting. Not the most exciting thing ever. The tie-ins are definitely a little more interesting than the main story, but I am excited to see where it goes. So with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end, and I will catch you all later. Peace. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and I just woke up, so you're gonna have to bear with me here, but we're covering both of the Batman tie-ins for the Night Terrors event. And like most of everybody on Earth at the moment, including most of the superheroes, Batman is contending with what is in effect his own worst nightmares, right? That's the power of Insomnia, this new god of nightmares. He can trap people inside their own heads. And so what this does is Bruce initially wakes up within Crime Alley. And this is just kind of a significant moment in his life. Most all of you guys know the origin of Bruce Wayne, right? That like his mom and dad were shot and killed, and then he inherited their money and then eventually became Batman. Crime Alley is where they died. And so in a lot of ways, he just kind of relives these exceedingly traumatic moments in his own life. Now, some of that is due to him really kind of needing to remember why he does all this in the first place. But some of it is also just a form of self-torture, right? Just putting himself through these terrible situations over and over and over again, and never really being able to move past past any of the original trauma that made him into the person that he was. And so while some of this is real and tangible and it's kind of a psychological effect, other aspects of this is just his own brain screwing with him. So for example, like his mom's pearls just come rolling down towards him and almost destroy him, and he ends up jumping inside the Monarch Theater. Now, one of the things to remember is that Insomnia is not manipulating or controlling any of this. This is 100% his own mind doing this. And so that's why when he gets into the Monarch Theater, a kind of projector just fires up and shows him what's actually going on in the real world right now, which is that Boston Brand Deadman is currently in possession of Batman's body, as Deadman tries to basically find a way to wake up all the superheroes who have fallen asleep and really most of the world's population. But within his own mind, and even once Batman realizes this, he's yanked to another location, which is actually his parents' home, right? Like the old Wayne Manor. And as he's there, instead of just simply seeing the gravestones of his parents, he's forced to witness the gravestones of everybody that he loves and cares about, right? This kind of symbolic idea that his actions will inevitably lead to the death of everybody he loves. And more so than that, the gravestones seemingly stretch on to infinity. And so it puts off this philosophy, right? This idea that Batman is nothing more than death and destruction reincarnate, and that's it. Now, one thing to know, right? This is an important thing to understand here. When it comes to Batman's mythos, that was kind of the case, but not the case. It didn't really become the case until the death of Jason Todd, right? The old Bob Kane, Bill Finger Batman stories from when he was first introduced in Detective Comics, Batman #1. Yes, they were really, really dark, but it was just kind of him doing whatever he needed to do to solve a crime, and his no-killing rule hadn't really been established by that point. He got really goofy in the 1960s, he got serious again in the 1970s under Neil Adams and Dennis O'Neil, but then Jason Todd dies. And the death of Jason Todd was one of the first real times in DC Comics where they introduced this concept of just like collateral damage, that Bruce Wayne, being Batman, will get people killed, and it'll be the people that he cares about and loves the most. And ever since then, ever since the death of Jason Todd in Death in the Family, it's been this concept of Batman and this kind of ongoing fear. Could what happened to Jason Todd happen to Tim Drake, Duke Thomas? Could it happen to Dick Grayson, right? Catwoman, any number of people. And so this fear is something he contends with on a regular basis. And even when Insomnia does manifest in this kind of mock getup that makes him look like Robin, although he's got an I instead of an R, he still toys with this very concept. Now, one of the things to know is that his attempt to manipulate Batman is one half-hearted, and the other half is just a really, really poor attempt, right? It's like, I grew up in Gotham and I lived here my whole traumatic life. It was always so cool that we not only have our very own superhero, we had the Batman. In fact, I'd love to be your sidekick. All you have to do is help me find the Nightmare Stone. Like, he's actually trying to get Batman to help him do this. And the reason why, as we talked about in our previous video, is that Dr. Destiny, a guy who previously had the Dream Stone, had warped it, twisted it, turned it into the Nightmare Stone, and then hid it in the nightmares of somebody on Earth. It's quite literally a needle in a haystack. And so this kind of half-hearted attempt to try to get Batman to his side, of course, it doesn't work. And because it doesn't work, you basically end up seeing these sort of physical manifestations of the people that Batman cares about just literally digging themselves out of graves, right? Like Commissioner Gordon and Batgirl and so on and so forth. And even Selina Kyle, Catwoman, shows up here as a sort of twisted and dead caricature to a degree. And so one of the things that he does is he sort of taunts and toys with Bruce Wayne, right? With Batman, and saying like, your greatest fear is happiness. That's your absolute most terrifying fear, is that you could become a happy person because all you've known is struggle and strife. Now that is, to a degree, a relatively accurate statement, right? There's a really good book out there called How the Mind Works, and it talks about this, and it talks about like trauma responses, right? That people will respond to trauma in a variety of different ways. Some people will develop dissociative identity disorder, right? So varying personalities designed to cope with the trauma that they can't cope with their quote-unquote core personality. Other people wall themselves off from the world. In the case of Bruce Wayne, he doesn't really have DID, but what he has done is just built up these walls. It's kind of a safety measure to a degree, right? If I never let people in, I never have to experience that kind of trauma again. And then to take it a step further and to justify his own perception, it's, I'm going to go into the world and I'm going to make sure that nobody has to experience that again. And it creates this really interesting situation where he is both a character suffering from a horribly traumatic traumatic experience, doing what most people with trauma responses do and approaching this in the worst way he possibly can, but at the same time, finding some measure of benefit in doing what he's doing. And one of the things that he does is he says, like, I'm not afraid of being happy, but his actions would actually say otherwise, right? In a moment when he had a chance to marry Catwoman, for example, ultimately she rejected him, but he never chased her. He never went after there and said, no, we're absolutely getting married because you're in love and I'm in love. We'll do our thing and we'll run off together and the city of Gotham will take care of itself and that'll be it. And so the other part of this, again, because it's kind of his mind messing with him, is that he actually just kind of like coughs up this gigantic bat with a gun attached to it, which is really, really twisted, but is incredibly symbolic, because what this does is it represents two sides of the same coin. It represents what Batman has become, but also what he could have been. Because remember, Batman has a no-killing rule, right? Specifically, he never uses guns under any circumstance, not even to taunt or wound people, because guns are what cost him his family. And so in a lot of ways, this bat represents that manifestation. Yes, it's Batman, but like Batman with a gun or something along those lines, which is kind of ironic because this is headcanon, so I'm not going to swear to the fact that it's true, but I want to say that in some of the very early comics in DC, that Batman did have a gun. But again, I'm not 100% sure about that, so I'm not going to swear, and honestly, it's not really important enough to look up. But it's just one of those things where in response to this, because of the fact that Insomnia tells Batman, I'm not the one doing this, your mind is the one doing this, you're the one doing all of this, it's the worst possible thing he could have said. And the reason why is because, yes, Batman is a prodigious fighter, and he is arguably the best fighter in the entirety of DC Comics, depending on who you're talking about, right? He's gone against Superman, he's faced off against Bronze Tiger, he's fought all kinds of different people. But the deadliest weapon in Batman's disposal is his mind. And so to turn around and tell him, your mind is the one doing all of this, is to tell him, you can control everything that's going on right now. You can decide what you do or do not do. And so that literally drives Batman to a point where he just tells Insomnia, thank you then, like, thank you for giving me that piece of information, transforms himself into a sort of god of nightmares, and then literally just takes off, right? Just effectively bails and gets out of there as fast as he possibly can. The problem with this is the mind is a powerful thing. And so even despite this sort of newfound power that he has within his own mind, his mind is still in control. What he has to do is figure out a way to take it over. And this all comes to bear when he's suddenly transported yet again, wakes up in Crime Alley, and he's Joe Chill. He's the guy that kills his parents. Now again, this is more of like a philosophical thing, right? This is not the real world. So it's not like he's been sent through time, right? And he's the guy that like solidifies his own existence. It is a nightmare for him, right? These are all nightmares that he's experiencing, right? What if something happened where he ended up being the one to kill his own parents? And so the kind of child version of himself, right, that was sort of witnessing all this, begins to freak out and begins to like attack him, ripping off the kind of Joe Chill skin, so to speak, revealing the Batman underneath. And it's like, you wanted to be Batman, right? Admit it, right? Our parents dying and all that kind of stuff. It was the catalyst because you just wanted to become this person, and just really sort of tearing through and almost getting to the heart of what Batman is, almost coming to this conclusion that like it was never about the death of his parents, right? It was a catalyst, but he always had a kind of inner darkness inside of him, that he was always twisted and screwed up ever since he was a little kid for any number of reasons, and he was always destined to become Batman. It's not necessarily true, but who said that nightmares are rational in the first place? And so the thing about this is that as these different kind of personalities begin to like multiply and duplicate and so on and so forth, Batman just gets out of there as fast as he possibly can. But he starts to realize what he can do within this realm. For example, he can fly. And he even makes a comment. He says, in the real world, I may not wish to have Superman's powers, but here in my dreams, it takes on a different meaning, right? So him being able to just kind of fly away and escape, it really represents more of him being able to harness control over himself than anything else. Now he says, my mind catalogs its dreams, right? Some are a glimpse into my complicated heart, some are lies. Now what's so ironic about this and interesting is that it does show a Dark Knight Returns moment when Batman fights Superman and Batman overpowers Superman. The real question to ask here is, does Batman dream of this? And if he does, why does he dream of alternate realities? Is that the way dreams work in DC Comics? Are they borrowing a page out of the Marvel Cinematic Universe and Doctor Strange 2 when they said your dreams are just glimpses into another person's life or another variant of you in the multiverse, and like that's it? But what he ends up doing is he comes to the realization the only way for him to really seize control of his own body, right, to really get back to the real world, is to focus on something called the Black Door, and behind it is his absolute worst nightmare. The nightmare, the fear, whatever you want to call it, that he keeps locked up, chained away so no one can access it, not even him. And so even when Insomnia does manifest, he says like, is this where Dr. Destiny housed my nightmare stone? And he tells Batman, open it up, right? Open the door. Now, the real question you got to ask yourself here is, do you really want to open a door to Batman's worst nightmare? Like, the guy is the living embodiment of just fear, right? Like, his job is to scare the absolute tarnation out of you. Do you really want to see what this guy's worst nightmare is? I mean, I'm just throwing it out there, right? I'm just kind of saying there are some things better left unsaid, and there are some things you just don't ask for, and that's it. Now, what's so funny about this, and I really feel like this is DC just kind of playing it fast and loose, and even just kind of having a little bit of fun with the Batman comic, right, is that something's going on out there in the real world, which is actually covered in the main Night Terror story itself. We will cover it, but the control that Insomnia has is beginning to loosen. Now, this is also because Batman's starting to take his mind back. So he's starting to come out of this nightmare and he's starting to push Insomnia out. But one of the things that happens is that he literally like fires off shots at Batman and he just kind of like stops them, like Neo from The Matrix, in literally the exact same way, like the little circles, right? Bullet time, the bullets slowing down. It's cool. It's fun. And he really can't be too upset about it. But ultimately, Insomnia is essentially forced out, right? This guy ends up just leaving and disappearing entirely. Batman destroys the gun bat, right? And then in turn, faces his own fear here, right? Faces the thing that terrifies him the most. Now, this is probably one of the greatest Batman moments that I think I've ever read about, because what he does is when he gets in there, he says, this is not part of my nightmare. This is me. He says, Insomnia was right about one thing before. There is a piece of me forever in that alley. The sound of gunshots is nothing unusual in Gotham. So when my parents died, it didn't draw any attention. I was alone with my parents' bodies for 90 minutes before a beat cop happened to pass by. But none of that is the nightmare I hid behind the Black Door. This boy was alone in that alley and he made a promise to himself, a vow of vengeance to make sure that whatever happened to him never happened to anyone else. And ever since that day, I have wondered, if this boy in the alley saw me today, would he be scared or disappointed in what I have become? And that's Batman's biggest fear. And it's actually beautiful, to be honest with you guys. And it really humanizes him in a lot of ways. The reason why I say that is because when you read Batman comics, especially in the modern era now, more so than really in years past, there really seems to be very much about Batman that is very much inhuman. He doesn't really feel like a human person. He feels like a person that just, maybe he has like unbreakable skin, or maybe he has like a mind that works like a computer, right? But he's got to have some kind of power, like some kind of an ability, right? It's hard to see him as an actual person. One, because he associates with superheroes so much, and two, his comics, even in the modern era, just in a lot of ways feel so over the top that like no human being could actually pull that off. That's one of the beautiful things about Dennis O'Neil and Neil Adams' run in the 70s, is that it was very much a return to Batman feeling more like a James Bond type character that was fallible and could be beaten, as opposed to a guy who could come out on top no matter the circumstance. And so this whole idea of his biggest fear being that he let himself down, that he disappointed that kid, that he strayed so far from the path that maybe there's no conceivable way for him to come back, is the most conceivable fear that you or I or anybody could possibly relate to, right? Because it really is kind of like how us as people function. I would go so far as to argue this little kid representing Bruce Wayne, it really is the idea that he's disappointed himself, right? That he is not, he knows he's not what he's supposed to be. He knows he's not doing what he's supposed to do. But then you get this amazing moment between the two of them. And so they finally have this conversation where he finally confronts this fear. He says that for a long time, you will live in the shadows, isolated, hidden, and shielded away from anything but your own mission. But others will find you in the dark. Friends that you can't imagine. Some who can fly and shoot lasers from their eyes, some who can stop bullets with their bracelets, and who are so fast they can break the speed barrier. And children who will make you into a better man. And where this little kid is like, that sounds like a dream, right? Sitting here, surrounded by his dead parents, feeling nothing but pain and anger and sadness. When he says, that sounds like a dream, it's a beautiful thing. And Batman says, it's more than that. It's your family. I'm doing everything I can not to make a Fast and the Furious joke. But it's one of those things where he literally hugs the younger version of himself and says, thank you, right? And his younger version says, I'm proud of you, but why are you dressed like a bat? And he says, because they can be scary. And his younger self says, bats are cool. And so it's him accepting that, yes, he would be proud. Like, he would be proud of the person that he'd become. He would be proud of who he is. It's a beautiful and wonderful thing. So in turn, he tells his own mind, wake up, and he just breaks free of Boston Brand's control, snaps out, and just starts controlling everything of his own accord. He jumps back to his own body. Batman is back. Now, the issue here is in Arkham Asylum, the Nightmare Realm seems to have taken complete and total control because it looks like the Nightmare Realm out in the real world. And so Batman is not entirely sure if what he's seeing is real or false. Enter his son Damian Wayne, who says this is the real world and we lost. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end. If you guys want to get caught up on Night Terrors, make sure you click this playlist and I will catch you all later. Peace. Okay, so we are covering the Joker tie-ins for Night Terrors and Batman kills himself. And it's hilarious. Okay, so this opens up with Batman and the Joker's henchmen on a rooftop, and Batman goes after the Joker and slips on water, cracks his face open on the roof, and then falls to his death. And Joker and them don't know how to handle it. Like, they don't know how to process it. They're like, is he gonna fall off? And then just like smashes, and it's like, I mean, is this like one of his jokes, or is this like some kind of a gag or like a scheme? Like, is this part of his plan? He's just laying down there dead. Or he's dead as a doornail. They get down there, like his arms and legs are broken, right? Blood all over the place. It's like, you should poke him, boss. Just, see what's up. And he's like, I pay you to do that. You poke him, right? So like literally they poke this guy and they realize, yeah, man, Batman's dead. And what's so crazy about this is like Joker's life loses any sense of meaning because of the death of Batman. Now, for the most part, we kind of know that because in DC Comics, it's long since been established that like Joker derives his sense of purpose from like chasing after Batman chasing after him, right? This kind of cat and mouse game. But at that point, he's like, all right, well, I mean, we can't leave him here. Like, grab the body and throw it in the trunk and we'll figure out what to do. And they're like, we took a train here. It's like, then steal a car, but like throw his body in the trunk and then we'll figure out what to do. So following that, you pick up in a diner where Joker and his henchmen are talking while Batman's cadaver is just sitting there next to the Joker, which is twisted but hilarious at the same time. I'm not gonna lie. Of course, they've killed everybody in the restaurant, right? No witnesses or anything. And they're just kind of like mulling over who it is that they're gonna kill next. And initially they talk about killing Superman, right? It's like, well, I mean, how are we supposed to kill Superman? The irony about this is that in Injustice Gods Among Us, Joker, well, he didn't really kill Superman, but he killed everybody who was close to Superman, which drove Superman insane. But it's not impossible to kill him, right? Some green kryptonite or whatever. So they come up with a scheme, right? This guy Gaggy, who's like the diminutive member of the henchman team, he comes across a scheme where there's like uranium that Joker and his guys can steal. So when they get aboard this ship, one, they're all dressed as pirates, which is amazing. And then two, when they realize it's just as simple as going in there, taking the uranium and leaving, even just like the challenge of doing this is kind of boring. And it's sort of hilarious because this just shows the state of Gotham that it was in when Batman was running around as a superhero. People felt relatively safe, so there was no need for like excess levels of paramilitary forces or anything like that. To a degree, it was kind of the equivalent of folks like leaving their doors unlocked. You wouldn't necessarily do that in Gotham, but like it's that equivalent, more or less. And so because of that, once they steal the uranium, then it's just kind of like, I mean, there doesn't really, it's just kind of like, whatever, man, like, we'll sell it or whatever, but like, the Joker's just kind of bored, right? Because it's just like, all these criminals are out there committing all these crazy crimes in Gotham, but there's no Batman. And so the Joker just doesn't really know what to do. Even his own henchmen bail out on him. And so once they take off, he ends up seeing this like classified ad in the newspaper for Wayne Enterprises, and he goes there for like a job application, right? He goes there, like, applies for a position, he gets hired on, and then he just like starts going through the Wayne databases, searching for like, where's all the money, secret weapons projects, just different things like that, which I feel like it would be hilarious if that was possible, right? Like, where's all the money? Like, level 6 in a giant vault, help yourself. Like, it would be absolutely hysterical if that were the case. But then ultimately he's introduced to a woman named Helen. Now, Helen is a girl that if you've ever worked in the corporate environment, you've probably wanted to help her finish with all her living somewhere along the line, because she's annoying as all get out. Like, literally when Joker tells her, like, my computer's broken, I think, like, I can't figure out where all the money is, and I can't find like all the super weapons projects and stuff like that. She's like, oh, that's not what we do here, right? Like, we are the approved expense reports section for the company. Like, our job is to approve reports that have already been approved. But it like annoys the heck out of the Joker, because now he's encountering what is in effect everybody's worst nightmare, which is basically just bureaucracy. Corporate bureaucracy, getting anything done. So literally his job is to sit in an office and approve reports that have already been approved by somebody else. That's his job. And it literally starts to drive him insane to the point where, like, there's this moment where she's like, we're more like a device, to the point where, like, she's trying to describe what they do, and he makes this comment. He's like, okay, I get it. We're like the corporate accounting seatbelt. She's like, no, we're like a device that makes sure that the seatbelt doesn't get damaged. A seatbelt protector. And he just looks at her like, really? I'm sorry, guys. It's one of the best Joker comics that I think I've ever seen. And it even gets to the point where, like, he pulls out a knife and he's just ready to just end this woman, right? Like, right there. And so following that, you actually end up transitioning to a point where he's meeting with the rest of the staff, right? Just kind of having a bit of a break. And he's like, I used to work for a calendar factory, but then they fired me for taking a day off. It's a terrible joke, but it's hilarious at the same time. But here's where things start to go south. So what ends up happening is this guy, Mr. Goodman, comes in, right? He's a higher up in the company. And of course, they refer to Joker as Johan. That's because he's just basically going by a fake name. But when this guy Goodman gets in, he kicks everybody out of the office and he sits down with Joker and he's like, okay, I've been looking over your end of month reports. And where Joker's like, are my numbers off? It's like, I don't know if it's an issue of your numbers being off, man, but there's all kinds of like insane scribbles on here, ridiculous drawings. And then you've got a drawing of me basically being deflowered by like a dog or a boar or something like that. And he's like, I really have to ask the question, man, do you have any idea what it is that you're doing? Now, as you guys know, Joker does not usually take kindly to insults of any kind. And so he does exactly what you would expect the Joker to do. He grabs a microwave, smashes it over this guy's head, turns it on, and kills him on the spot, and then basically just takes off the rest of the day. Now, what's also kind of crazy about this is that when he comes back in the next morning, he's got this giant trench coat on, right? He's got like this loudspeaker hooked up to him, and he just starts like rambling on to all these people in these endless rows of cubicles about how they're all just groveling worms, right? Cogs in a machine that seeks to destroy them, that they're bootlickers of a capitalist state that seeks only to exert control over them. And literally, like, he ends up in the office of John D, right? Kind of like the top dog over here at Wayne Enterprises. And what's crazy is the Joker puts on a gas mask. He opens up his trench coat and it's just got what looks like explosives inside of it. At the very least, just massive amounts of Joker toxin. He intends to take like the whole place down, but then he's offered the job of Mr. Goodman, whom he killed. And of course, he takes the offer. And so a few weeks later, as he's like going through and telling everybody, like, the company's basically going belly up, right? Like, all of our stock values are down. Everything's trending in the downward direction. It's the end of times. Things are going south. That you basically have people who are kind of laughing at the jokes that he's making. And nobody really seems to be caring about the fact that the Joker's killing the company. So where he ends up going out with drinks for everybody, he ends up traveling back home. He puts on Real Housewives. Now, here's the kicker Joker about all this. Batman's body is just a corpse sitting in the closet of the Joker. That's really all it is. It's just kind of hanging there, lingering there, maybe as some kind of a trophy, but it actually does serve a purpose. And the reason why is this. There are rumors circulating around the city of Gotham that Batman is back, right? People have literally seen him. And in fact, there was one point where he came by the office. And so the Joker is completely and totally unaware of this fact. He doesn't know that Batman's back. And if Batman's back, then how in the world do you have a situation where Batman is basically, or at least his body is in the Joker's closet, who's masquerading as Batman? And so what we end up getting is this amazing moment where these crazy nonsensical henchmen are doing crazy nonsensical things, and the Batman pops up, right? Now he shows up at night, just like you would expect, and he's attacking everybody here. But it's not Batman who like disarms people, right, and so on and so forth. No. This is a Batman who kills. He's like throwing batarangs into people. He kicks a guy into a fire and lets him burn alive, right? The whole time he's just laughing and carrying on. Now, as you can probably guess, this is the Joker. The Joker is masquerading as Batman. Or is he? Because then he suddenly snaps awake. He just wakes up. Now, the crazy thing about this is he's also got a wife and a son. It's kind of nuts, right? Like literally he's got a whole family and his wife's just like, Johan, you're just having another one of your bad dreams. It's cool, right? Like the son wakes up, the son gets put back to sleep again, right? That kind of thing. So then you jump to an interview that's being done for a position between Mr. Freeze and the Joker. Seemingly, these guys have never met before. And the funny thing is one of the funniest interviews ever, where Joker basically asks him in corporate speak, what makes you think you'd be a good fit for the company? What do you think your strengths and weaknesses are? And he's like, well, my biggest weakness is warmth. And my biggest strength is that I've shut myself off from compassion, empathy, and other emotions that have made the world grow weak, right? So like all the angsty people on Reddit is basically what Mr. Freeze is. And so where Joker keeps calling him Mr. Fries, because technically it is spelled the way you would spell fries, but it is pronounced freeze, that they kind of go back and forth a little bit, where it's like, it's actually freeze. Fries, your name is spelled Fries, it's pronounced Fries. Like, no, it's spelled Fries, but it's pronounced Freeze. And it's like, whatever, man, who cares, right? Like, why do you want to work here? And the thing about this is that Victor Freeze and a lot of the other traditional villains out there in Gotham, Scarecrow and those guys, they see the Joker as somebody up there in a kind of ivory tower to a degree. And while the city itself is effectively falling apart, and even Batman returning is really more of a hyper-violent Batman, killing and destroying everything, is one of these situations where in a lot of ways they kind of blame the Joker, right? Like, you killed Batman and you're the reason why this crazy Batman is here now killing people, and why Gotham is probably even worse of a place than it was before, because this Batman is more effective than he was before. And so it's kind of wild, because following that moment we actually figure out what's going on here. That Joker is in the middle of sleeping. He gets up and he puts on the Batman costume. When he's masquerading as Batman, he's actually sleepwalking. That's what's going on here. And I gotta be honest with you guys, it's kind of dope, because as he's doing this, he ends up like running out into the city of Gotham. He ends up coming across Gaggy, his former henchman, along with him having a couple of his own henchmen, and then starts like attacking them. And then Gaggy realizes it is the Joker masquerading as Batman, but at the end of the day, there's no reasoning with him. Now, what you could argue here is Joker is actually suffering from dissociative identity disorder, right? The Batman persona is a whole different personality designed to cope with the trauma of him killing Batman. It's messed up in a lot of ways. But hey, whoever said the Joker was a guy who was not screwed up? The guy is the definition of a broken human being, right? So the thing about this is that you end up transitioning to like a company baseball game, right? Wayne Enterprises versus LexCorp, and the Joker in the middle of all this like freaks out when one of the guys that works for LexCorp, the second baseman, makes this offhanded joke about how Lex Luthor keeps striking everybody out, and the Joker's the only one that seems to be able to get a hit on the ball, so they should just start calling him Batman. He literally chokes the guy to death. Now, something that I want you to notice here, everybody's very cavalier, right? They're very nonchalant about the Joker killing a guy, right? Because remember, this is all a nightmare for him, right? This is night terrors. This is all taking place in his head. That's one of the things to remember about the whole night terrors tie-ins. It's all going on in Joker's head. And so it's kind of just the world in which he lives. And so what ends up happening here is that Bruce Wayne himself, who is actually the coach for the Wayne Corp team, basically the guy who runs the entirety of Wayne Enterprises, as you would expect, ends up inviting Joker over for dinner. And when they get in there, of course, John Dee's there, because John Dee is basically like the Alfred stand-in in a lot of ways for Bruce Wayne and so on. And Bruce Wayne, of course, asks him, like, do you have any kind of a shellfish allergy? Well, Joker's like, no. And I mention that because when they get there, basically shellfish is what's being served. Now, the thing about this is that there's a comment that's made by John Dee, or really Winifred is the name that he's given here, where every time Bruce Wayne eats shellfish, he starts to kind of become a little unhinged, right? He sort of starts to go a little bit nuts. But there's this comment that he makes about how he pretty much knows that Joker is nuts, that Joker's going crazy, and Joker is basically becoming Batman. Now, the question that has to be asked here is, if Batman's dead, what's the deal here with Bruce Wayne? We're not given an answer. We're not. Because this is designed to take place in Joker's head, and Joker's insane, and there's very rarely any clear answer to anything. It's done in a very fast and loose and really cavalier way, which works. I think it fits in perfectly with the nature of the Joker's mantra, but then he suddenly skips forward to a point where he's giving like this meeting to everybody in the office, and all these board members are basically Batman villains who have been brought in by the Joker and effectively work on the board of trustees, or work as the main board for Wayne Enterprises, and there's just like this guy named Ethan who is just kind of a bit of a goofball. So Joker stabs him to death with a pencil and then just kind of has him escorted out. The problem is that once Joker gets back home, his son has discovered Batman's corpse in his closet. So the Joker starts pushing the corpse back in, and then he tells his son, you got to forget everything you saw. I don't know what's going on here. It's just one of these things. Never come in here. This is weird, right? Just ignore what you saw. Not a great big huge deal. So even where the kid leaves and his wife comes in, the Joker kind of dismisses it and says, no, I just had a really bad day at the office and I took it out on my son. It's that kind of a thing. I need to go for a walk. So what he does is he concocts this scheme because he has not figured out that he's Batman. He hasn't connected the dots yet. And so with this scheme that he has, the whole goal is to basically trap Batman, right? Like he pulls together like all these resources and he creates like a Joker toxin and all that kind of stuff. And he even like brings together all these henchmen and everything. The kicker here is he decides to lay down and take a nap before Batman arrives, or I guess kind of goes out into the night the way he normally does. And of course, that's when the Batman persona takes over. And when that happens, he immediately starts attacking everybody, right? Like just starts jumping in, attacking criminals everywhere he sees them, right? And he starts making like all these just terrible jokes at the same time. He's like, did you hear about the jogger who's afraid of speed bumps? He's slowly getting over it. I love the Joker's jokes. I don't care how corny they are. They always come off as amazing. But what seems to have happened here, kind of filling in the blanks a little bit, maybe the Joker really does seem to have figured out that his alternate persona is Batman. That when he's asleep, he's running around as Batman in the city of Gotham. Most likely it came off the heels of the conversation that he had with Bruce Wayne. So bringing together all these different henchmen was designed for the purpose of tracking himself. Sure, like there's the whole idea of Batman and like they are there because it was the Joker's plan to quote unquote catch Batman, but I'm talking about like a subconscious level, right? Like he wanted to catch himself. He just wasn't consciously aware of the fact that he was looking to capture himself, right? It feeds into that kind of notion that, what is it, like serial killers want to be caught, which is why they broadcast their crimes all over the place. But regardless of how you slice it, all of the Joker's forces come running in. And as soon as that happens, despite the fact that Joker's trying to fight them off as best he can, that literally they pop their Joker toxin, right? His mask comes off. All of his henchmen realize he is actually Batman. Even he himself realizes that he's Batman. And in these final moments, he starts screaming out and calling out about how they can't kill Batman, that they need Batman, that he needs Batman, that they all have to have Batman, that Batman has to exist, right? Like literally losing his mind. He wakes up in the real world, right? The nightmare ends. He just wakes up in the real world. And he's just kind of like, well, that was weird. Right, that was strange. And he's like, so literally talking like all these henchmen that he had fallen asleep next to when the God of Nightmares had basically attacked everybody and put them all into a dream state. He's like, so that was all basically just nightmare? And Solomon Grundy in his half-broken English is like, yeah, like you're among friends now. And the Joker's like, everybody shut up, man. I'm going to go back to sleep. And the story ends. With that being said, guys, if you want to get caught up on Night Terrors, make sure you guys click the link to this playlist and I will catch you all later. Peace. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with Night Terrors, and we pick up with one of the coolest characters from DC Comics, which is the Sandman, Wesley Dodds. Now, two main things are going to happen when it comes to Wesley Dodds. Number one, he's going to give us this really cool story about the Nightmare Stone, and number two, he is most likely going to come back to DC Comics, and I'll explain how that happens as we get further through this. But what ends up going on here is that Deadman, who's currently in possession of Batman's body because Bruce Wayne himself is dreaming just like everybody else, he approaches Sandman for the purpose of figuring out what he knows about the Nightmare Stone. Now, the reason for this is because Wesley Dodds has a very close history with Dream of the Endless. And for those of you guys who don't know what the Endless are, they are about as close as you get in DC Comics to cosmic entities. The cosmic entity concept is not really a one-to-one between DC and Marvel. They just kind of do it in their own differing ways. But Dream represents the very concept of dreaming, so he is immensely powerful. But there is the Dream Stone that exists, and seemingly over the course of DC Comics, they've presented this idea that the Nightmare Stone is a twisted version of the Dream Stone. So who better to ask here than Wesley Dodds? Now, the only information that he really offers is he says at some point in the early history of his superhero antics, he had basically come across a ritual sacrifice being performed by the ultra rich who were bored and delving into crazy magics, and they were attempting to summon the Nightmare Stone. And so when Wesley Dodds jumped in and then saved the person who was going to be sacrificed, he basically realized that person was part of the cult, that him sacrificing his life would bring the Nightmare Stone into fruition because the rest of the cult leaders, or at least the members of the cult, had basically consumed a kind of death potion. The problem with this is that even after this guy takes his own life and the rest of the cult effectively dies, the Nightmare Stone appears for a brief moment and then disappears again. Now, much like what we're seeing here with Insomnia, the main villain of this story, this cult sought the Nightmare Stone for the purpose of using its power to basically conquer the world. But following its disappearance, Wesley Dodds had literally traveled around to the most prominent members of the Justice Society of America, which is to say, the forerunners to the Justice League before the Justice League ever became the Justice League, and in turn asked them if they knew anything about this, right? Talking to Dr. Fate, Kent Nelson, Alan Scott, the original Green Lantern, anybody who had dealt with magic or mysticism, but none of them had ever heard of the Nightmare Stone. So seemingly, Wesley Dodds was the only one aware of its existence. And so following that, he basically ended up departing, and then, of course, once he's told by Deadman, okay, I appreciate the help, we got to get you back in your grave, his response is, but like, this is a case I have to solve, so I'm going to stick around with you until this case is done. Having said that, that's likely how Wesley Dodds is going to stick around in DC Comics. There's going to be, quote unquote, more unsolved cases from his early days. He's going to try to figure those out in the modern era, and he'll stick around. It'll be DC's test bed to see whether or not anybody cares. If nobody cares, they'll cancel the comic. If everybody cares, they'll keep him around. So if you love Sandman, make sure you read a solo comic when it comes out. But what we end up doing here is basically picking up with Deadman and Sandman traveling to Terrifictech, basically the base of operations for Michael Holt, Mr. Terrific, one of the smartest men in the world, if not the smartest man in the world in DC Comics. For those of you guys who are new to DC, what you're going to learn is that when it comes to like the smartest people, you have like Bruce Wayne, Lex Luthor, Mr. Terrific. It just kind of shifts around from time to time depending on who's telling the story, so it's not that dissimilar from Marvel. But the problem with this is that if you guys recall the previous videos that we've done, at one point, Deadman had tried to jump into the memories of Insomnia, this guy who's instigating this whole situation in the first place. And he's only ever been getting glimpses. But what it's done is it's created a bridge where sometimes he's unwillingly pulled into the memories of Insomnia, and other times he travels there of his own accord. In this particular instance, he's effectively pulled, and he ends up finding out that this guy was being subjected to these kind of experiments, right? That following the whole situation where he was exposed to the Lazarus Rain, which is to say that whole Lazarus pit situation, Lazarus planet, which basically granted different people powers around the world. That's really the long and short of it, that nobody fully understood how his powers worked. And in what really seemed more like nefarious purposes than anything else, he was being experimented on, presumably in an attempt to better understand how his powers work and how they function. But because the whole event of Lazarus planet and the Lazarus Rain being spread around the world was part and parcel to the actions of the Justice League during the DC Comics story where the Justice League died and then eventually came back. Insomnia celebrated their deaths, but then was just totally pissed off about the fact that they had come back to life, and they had come back as their normal selves, whereas he'd been changed and twisted by the Lazarus Reign. So it's really more of just anger and vendetta, right? It's really just that simple. Now, there is more to his character than all of that, and there really is a whole reason why he even became so twisted in the first place. But before we get an answer, ultimately, Deadman is forced out of the head of Insomnia, and then in turn, he's actually forced to sort of endure his own little bit of a nightmare. Not a full-on one per se, it's really what's called the sleepless night, so basically the henchman of Insomnia, that because Insomnia can't really exist in the real world for a prolonged period of time, he sends his own henchmen out. Are they important? No, not really. I mean, they're here and like they do some stuff, but like they're the least important part of the story. What is cool here though is that once these sleepless nights make their move, the entire group is met by the arrival of Damian Wayne. Now, for those of you guys who are new to DC Comics, if you've been around for a while, you know who Damian Wayne is. Bear with me here for a second for the new folks. Damian Wayne is the son of Bruce Wayne, and his story is really, really cool. He was like the son that Bruce Wayne never knew he had. It's an amazing story that we should actually cover because there's some really cool stuff that happens there. But Damian's hardcore, right? This kid is super intense, so much so that he overpowers these sleepless nights. And while he's not really capable of like destroying them per se because of just the level of power that they have, it is enough to bide some time. Not only that, this kid's been flying the Batwing, which I think is pretty dope, right? Like a 12-year-old kid flying the Batwing. It's kind of awesome. I wish I could have done that when I was 12 years old. I love it. But the thing about this is that once he rescues Deadman and he rescues Sandman, in turn, he actually tells Deadman, get out of the body of Bruce Wayne. Now, for those of you guys who remember the Batman tie-ins for this is that moment when Bruce Wayne realizes he's possessed and that Deadman leaves momentarily. He ultimately does come back. But that's kind of the issue, is we haven't really caught up to the point where you get to the end of the Batman 2-issue tie-in where like he wakes up from everything, or at least presumably wakes up. But the thing about this is that when they ask the question, how in the world are you awake while everybody else in the world is asleep? Damian's like, well, I mean, through the power of plot armor, right? Like I've mastered every form of meditation in existence, and so I'm basically willing myself to stay awake, which I do joke about it being a plot armor thing. Damian could actually do that, right? Just because of the level of training he has, which in a lot of ways, I would argue, actually exceeds the training of Batman, right? But he is an exceedingly capable kid. He's pretty intense, right? Honestly, I don't care what line of logic they use. It's just cool to see he's here. But what we end up doing is basically jumping back to the memories of Insomnia and learning more about his past. Now, one of the things that I hope you notice here is that the dreams are almost kind of given to us out of order, right? It's just these glimpses that Deadman gets, and we're not really given a kind of chronological order here at all. And presumably what had happened is that when it came to Insomnia, and after experiencing this kind of Lazarus Reign, he keeps talking about these sort of dreams he has, or these visions that he would have whenever it was that he went to sleep. But then it started getting to the point where anytime he closed his eyes, that he started to see things. And so where he's basically talking to what really is a kind of Narcotics Anonymous group, due to the fact that he had basically tried to attain medications and then in turn was busted by the cops, and because of his past was basically, you know, told, hey, you got to come to a NA meeting, that he tells them, I can never sleep. He's on coffee all the time, he's popping meds all the time, anything he can do to keep himself awake. And so where this guy, right, the leader, or really the head of the group, starts telling him, well, I mean, there's something that you're going to have to do here. You're eventually going to have to forgive the Justice League. So again, it does kind of look like it's potentially in a chronological order, that he in turn freaks out, right? Like he smashes the coffee pot, takes one of the shards of glass, and then cuts his own eyelids off, along with just killing this guy. Because the idea is that if he can never close his eyelids, he can never go to sleep. So seemingly that's how he started to go insane. And in fact, because Deadman is here in his mind looking at his memories, he actually responds to him directly. And he literally tells him, do not go any further. You won't like what you see. And so what's really interesting is that Deadman comes to this realization that yes, Insomnia is looking for the Nightmare Stone. The problem here is that he's looking in people's nightmares and he can't find it. In anybody's nightmare, nightmares anywhere in the world. At the same time, he cannot find it in the real world. And so that's when Sandman says, then there's only one conceivable place that it could have been put, which is between the real world and the dreaming world, right? The in-between. And so concocting another one of his potions, right, as a kind of special sleeping gas, he in turn sprays down Boston Brand and Damian Wayne, which basically puts them in this kind of place between sleep and awake. And they're able to access the in-between. Now, one of the Sleepless Knights busts in and like Sandman kind of tries to fight this guy with like a sword. He says on guard, and like that's cool. But if for no other reason than understand what was going on, we had to give him some kind of context. So the thing here is that once you get to the in-between, Batman and Damian, really Deadman and Damian, start making their way through here because there really is no true north. There's no real true guide per se. But what they realize is that Insomnia is trying to force his way into this realm. And whether it's just because of the natural limitation of Insomnia's power, meaning he affects nightmares and affects dreams, therefore he cannot enter a place that doesn't really pertain to dreams or nightmares directly, or it's some other force that's keeping him at bay, he just simply can't access this realm. And so once they get into basically the House of Horror in DC Comics, which kind of bounces around and has a whole history, we don't necessarily need to go into it, what they end up doing is once they get in, they're forced to kind of experience this sort of test, right, where they basically endure their own personal nightmare. For the character of Deadman, it's the realization that where his origin story was that he was a victim of what was basically a kind of hit, and that the trapeze line was cut. He basically fell to his death, much in the same way that like the Flying Graysons, right, the parents of Dick Grayson had died, that his lie had always been, well, I died before I hit the ground, when in reality, he didn't. He hit the ground and then he started dying, broke every bone in his body, basically, like the dude was shot, right? And like every bone in his body is basically broken and the guy's just sitting there struggling, but he had effectively lied to everybody. And so confronting that lie, accepting that lie, and coming to terms with that lie, while Damian Wayne does the exact same thing, it ultimately results in the manifestation of the Nightmare Stone. And so once they have it, they can seize possession of it. Now that's exactly what the cult did. The difference is the cult tried to bring it into the real world as opposed to traveling to its location, seizing it, and then bringing it back to the real world, right? So two completely different things. But now that they have this Nightmare Stone, they can in turn go forward and then use its power to face off against Insomnia. What form that takes, I have no idea. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end. If you wanna get caught up on Night Terrors, make sure you click this link to the Night Terrors playlist, and I will catch you all later. Peace. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with Night Terrors, and this is Shazam, the god of nightmares, and he's watching on as everybody in the Shazam family burns to death. I don't know why I think that's funny. That's not funny at all. So the thing about this basically is just the result of what's going on with the Night Terrors event, which is to say, basically all the superheroes and even the supervillains are just kind of stuck in this sort of nightmare comatose state, where they're forced to endure these nightmare experiences over and over and over again. For Mary Marvel, Billy Batson basically becoming evil, like Black Adam, is like her worst nightmare. And in fact, when she woke up in this nightmare realm, the other members of the Shazam family, specifically Darla and a few others, were trying to get water because there was a fire, but there was no water anywhere. And that's when Billy Batson showed up and simply said, no, I'm just gonna let him die. And in fact, he tries to stop her when she goes to their aid. Now, the funny thing about this is that when she goes to attack, he shouts Shazam and turns back into Billy Batson, and that basically stops her. Because the reality here is that Mary is not aware of the fact that she's in a nightmare. Now, for those of you guys who would look at this circumstance and see like a house on a barren wasteland and all that kind of stuff, and you would think that would alert her to the fact that she is in basically a dream state or really just some place that's not the real world. One of the things to keep in mind with the Shazam family is they're routinely going on these wild and zany adventures, right? Like Shazam and the Seven Magic Lands. They end up in these places where you like come aboard and you bring along all your hopes and dreams, and together you'll find everything that you're looking for, right? The compass is left behind and it'll only slow you guys down. So they end up in this situation where their heart will be their guide and they raise the sails and then take the helm, right? That's really what you run into in the Shazam stories. And so because of this, I really hope people got the reference. Because of this, it's not something she's immediately aware of. right? And so even then, when Shazam basically takes away her ability to use her own powers, she does exactly what you would expect with somebody like Mary Marvel and just goes running into the house to try to rescue them anyway. Now, that's one of the more important things in all seriousness when it comes to the Shazam family. The reason why the power was even bestowed upon them in the first place was because of the strength of character that they had. That sure, not necessarily having any abilities, still, they would go forward and engage in what you and I would consider to be tasks of bravery. And so that's why they were even granted that ability in the first place. Now, what's so interesting here is that despite her being in a dream state, she says the word Shazam, and then suddenly her powers emerge. And that's when she's met with the rest of the Shazam family, coming to this realization she's been sleeping this whole time. But then in turn, we find out that's not even real, because her father manifests as what's basically like a giant bug and tells her to go back to sleep. So in the real world, she's totally out of it, right? Like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, right? She's like saying Shazam, getting her powers, saying Shazam, going back to normal over and over and over again, because she simply just says the words in a dream state, and it doesn't matter what mental state you're in, as long as you say the word, the transformation will happen. And so once she really kind of comes to on Friday, she still hasn't quite figured out that she's in a dream. And so as she's talking to her parents, they start saying like, you were calling the thunder last night, and so on and so forth. A lot of what seems to mirror what's going on in the real world. And to her mind, it all seems legitimate until she gets into like this impossibly long taxi and is taken to a quote unquote dream specialist. Now, along the way, the driver reveals himself to actually be Insomnia. Again, this main villain for the Night Terror story that's really just kind of jumping in and out of people's own nightmares, looking for this ridiculously powerful artifact called the Nightmare Stone that would allow him to keep the world in a sleeping state and then conquer all of existence. And so even then, where she's kind of taunted that she can't protect her family, she can't keep her family safe, the idea behind this is to sort of keep them trapped in this realm. And that's why so much psychological warfare is used, because if you can keep somebody mentally and emotionally tied down to where they are, then their focus and their efforts would be kept in the here and now. Despite talk of saying like, I can save my family, I can keep them safe, the whole conversation keeps her believing she can affect the world she's in. And so long as she believes it's real, she'll stay trapped in it. That was the benefit of Damian Wayne. Damian Wayne realized incredibly fast that he was in a dream world and then learned to control his own dreams and then engineered his own escape. Mary Marvel is no Damian Wayne. She's cool, but she's no Damian Wayne. And so that's when she starts to put two and two together, because she ends up in this kind of sleep specialist hospital, which of course is twisted and screwed up and all that kind of stuff. It's a very dark and sinister looking place. And when she goes to say the word Shazam, she's immediately snatched up by Billy Batson. And every time she tries to say the word, she basically starts kind of coughing up and spewing out stuff that keeps her from being able to complete it. And so Billy Batson arrives on the scene and says, that's my word, not yours. You want to say it to save everyone, but I'm the only one who really knows how to use it. And he says, let me show you. And what he does is he brings each member of her family in front of her, shouts the word, they're electrocuted, and they die. He literally kills her family in front of her. And it's dark, man. It's brutal. Like every single person ends up getting killed. And so ultimately, after everybody's dead, he walks up to her to say the word Shazam. Now that's where things start to get cool, and that's kind of the nature of her magic, because one of the things to remember when it comes to the members of the Shazam family, they're not like Superman, right? Where like they're exposed to a yellow sun and they get powers and they're super strong and fast. No. Their abilities come from gods outside and within the realm of the DC universe, right? The wisdom of Minerva, different things like that. Gods would not be affected by the power of Insomnia. At least we're largely led to believe they wouldn't, because gods don't really sleep, at least not as far as we're aware. And so because of that, the wisdom of Minerva comes into play, not in so much that like Minerva shows up and touches her forehead and says, let me show you the truth, but really more in the sense that she starts to realize she really is in a dream state. Nothing she's seeing is real. And that's why I say it's really cool the way this is done, because for someone like Mary Marvel and the crazy escapades they've had, things like this happen all the time. So how do you differentiate between a circumstance you encounter every single week and suddenly being in a dream state? The idea of Billy being evil, that's the kicker to her. That's the thing that sets her off, because he refers to himself as the captain as Billy. And that's when she says, no, Billy Batson would never turn into a villain. He would die before he did, except for the Injustice universe when he became a bad guy. But outside of that, right? I mean, he was a bad guy. Sure, Superman killed him, whatever. He was a bad guy. Like, you cannot argue that he wasn't. So the cool thing here is that ultimately the fight breaks out between the two of them. We basically end up learning that Billy Batson is effectively Insomnia masquerading as Billy, which most all of you probably figured out by now. The real kicker about this is now Mary has to figure a way out. And that's the thing here. It's one thing to understand and to realize she's in a dream state. It's another to do something about it. And so once this takes place, she literally leaves her physical form and starts jumping into the bodies of the other members of her family in order to, one part, wake them up to the reality of what's going on, but also help them overcome their own dreams. Darla has the most adorable dream, if we're being honest with ourselves, right? Like, it's just like these giants, but because Darla is a diminutive girl, right, she's the youngest, like, adults are the things that terrify her the most, and they're kind of like these omnipresent, overwhelming things. It's like the cutest thing ever, right? So like, Mary teams up with Darla and like they beat up the adults, something that we all wanted to do when we were little kids. All we wanted to do was just be left alone and eat candy for dinner. What's so wrong with that? But the thing about this is that, of course, once they overcome these adults, then Mary realizes this is a possibility. And so then she jumps into the dream of Eugene, and then in turn helps Eugene. Now, the funny thing about this is that Insomnia does reappear, and he even goes so far as to say, it doesn't matter whose dream you're in, I have access to everybody's dream. But whether you consider it to be hokey or one of the hallmarks of the Shazam storyline, the power of family basically prevails here, right? Like, she overcomes this guy and then in turn shouts Shazam. That gives Eugene his powers, and the kids that were bullying him and that were picking on him, Eugene helps them to understand their place in the bigger picture. And then following that, she ends up going to basically see Pedro. Pedro's giving like this great big huge speech on a tour bus. Everybody's laughing at him because he has no pants. So she shouts Shazam, he gets his suit, he gets his pants, and then he probably helps the tourists understand their place in the bigger picture, maybe even help them finish with all their living. But the thing here is that jumping from one person to the next, basically granting them their powers and then waking them up to what's going on, they're all coming to the realization that they are in a dream state. Now, that's one of the things about the Shazam family, and it's really what kind of makes them unique in a lot of different ways. But even with Mary Marvel herself, right, where she goes and like rescues her dad and then brings the essence of her father into her mother's mind, and they become pirates, which is amazing. I love pirates. I absolutely love the idea of pirates. It's just like the most amazing concept ever. Of course, Insomnia steps in again. And in fact, the fight between the two of them transitions through dream states, right? Like jumping through other people's dreams, fighting through other people's dreams. You don't really get to see a whole lot of what's going on, but the real fear, right? The real meat and potatoes of what drives the fear of Mary Marvel is that she'll ultimately be forgotten. That Billy Batson as a superhero will become so popular and so famous that nobody will remember Mary Marvel. Now, this is kind of a funny thing because it's actually a reference to DC Comics in the 70s and 80s. For those of you guys who don't know what I'm talking about here, when Billy Batson first showed up on the scene in DC Comics, he was actually a product of a company called Fawcett Publications. He was more popular than Superman. So DC sued Fawcett basically over copyright grounds. The lawsuit stayed in court for like 10 years. Eventually, DC got the rights to Shazam as a character and then shelved him until the 1970s, so there was nobody out there that could challenge the popularity of Superman. But once he came back, him and the Shazam family were in their own universe called Earth S. But with characters like Mary Marvel going into like the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s, she largely became a forgotten character. Her and the rest of the Shazam family, they were there, but nobody was ever really there for them. They were there for Shazam. So it's a great metatextual commentary on the history of her relationship with like DC as a publishing company, and even like us as the comic book readers. It's pretty cool, right? It's pretty awesome. But of course, the rest of the Shazam family basically show up invading her dream, and then they in turn attack Insomnia. And what it does is it allows all of them to effectively wake up to the reality of what's going on. Mary Marvel is the one who wakes up in this story, but the real kind of indication is like everybody will start coming up as well. But the funny thing here is that even when she awakes and she looks out the window, she sees what looks like an evil Shazam, right? Now, of course, it is Insomnia momentarily here in the real world, but DC could build off of this, and they could in turn springboard this into a story that focuses on an evil version of Shazam that's not Black Adam. And I'm not gonna lie to you guys, that would be pretty dope. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end. If you need to get caught up on Night Terrors, make sure you click this link to the Night Terrors playlist, and I will catch you all later. Peace. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and the God of Nightmares conquers reality in Night Terrors Part 4. So this picks back up again with Damian Wayne, the son of Batman who's possessed by Deadman. If you don't know what that means, it's not overly important. And then of course, Wesley Dodds Sandman, who is very much entwined with the idea of dreams, nightmares, different things like that. All of this is important because, as we talked about in our previous video, they now have possession of the Nightmare Stone, which is to say, the God of Nightmares is very much like Freddy Krueger in the sense that he only really exists in people's nightmares. And that's basically it. As long as you're awake in the real world, you're basically fine. But in the same way that rattlesnake antivenom is derived from rattlesnake venom, the belief is that by using the Nightmare Stone, they can basically overcome the power of the God of Nightmares. And so what they end up doing as they make their way into Arkham Asylum, which according to their best estimations is where the physical body of the God of Nightmares is currently residing, once they get in there, you have this really interesting moment where like Batman, Deadman, whatever you want to call him, is just kind of like, okay, so this is obviously some kind of a trap, right? Like, I mean, this whole entire city is encased in just like this really dark, nasty looking ooze type stuff to reflect the kind of corruption of the God of Nightmares as it's slowly eking its way into the real world. But here inside on this level, everything is so perfectly clean. And so that's kind of their concern, because as they make their way through Arkham Asylum, Damian Wayne momentarily falls asleep. Now, one of the things to remember is that Damian Wayne, like most everybody else on Earth, did initially succumb to the influence of the God of Nightmares, which was basically putting everybody to sleep, right? Making them fall asleep and then essentially keeping them asleep. But the crazy thing about Damian is that due to a combination of his training from the League of Assassins, as well as his time with Batman and even his own individual studies, he was basically able to control his dreams and wake up out of his own dream, right? So he kind of kicked himself up. Most people can't do that. And in fact, Batman can't even do that, which is a pretty impressive feat when you look at it on the whole for Damian. But as he falls asleep here, Batman kind of turns around and greets him. And he says like, "It's me, Damian. Deadman left my body to go ahead. He's gone to battle Insomnia by himself. You don't have to keep going. We can go home now, father and son, finally together again." And that's when Damian's like, "You're not my father." Like, he immediately attacks Insomnia. Now, of course, at that moment, Damian's woken up, right? Like, he's kind of shaken awake and the whole thing is revealed to basically be a nightmare. But Damian Wayne realizing that, it contrasts starkly to what actually happens in the world, which is Damian asks what happens. Sandman says, "You started to fall asleep when we were going up the stairs." And Batman just says, "Keep an eye on him, Dodds. This will all be over soon." So what's really interesting here is that Damian realized Batman was not his dad because he was caring, because he was compassionate, right? That's not Bruce Wayne. Despite all of his faults and imperfections, that's just not who he is. He loves his son, but that's just not the kind of person that he is. So I found that kind of interesting. And I felt like that was something worth paying particular attention to here, because it really feeds into the nature and the relationship between Batman and Damian Wayne. But what ends up happening is that even with Boston Brand himself, as he makes his way towards like the actual door, these kind of like apparitions, right? Manifestations, specifically of Dove, who's a long dead superhero in DC Comics, but was at one point the interest or love interest of Deadman, manifests, right? And it's like, what's so wrong with the idea of Insomnia killing everybody on Earth? We would all be able to be together, right? You and I would be together again and that kind of thing. But ultimately, Deadman's just kind of like, no, that's not how things are supposed to be. And we can't let the bad guy win. Now, there is history there between Boston Brand and Dove in the sense that, like, yes, they were love interests. Boston Brand was actually jumping from body to body in in order to have a relationship, even a physical relationship with Dove. It was kind of strange, not gonna lie, right? But it's one of those weird moments. Regardless, once they get into the actual room, quite literally, it looks like the stuff of nightmares. But we get this really cool explanation before we get the origin of the God of Nightmares, where we're basically told by Deadman that his name is Christopher Lucas, that he was a killer who refused to sleep, so the press called him Insomnia. He was locked up in Arkham after he said that he saw something in his dreams that drove him mad. And the doctors here forced him to stay asleep. So it's almost kind of like a torment. It's almost a bit of a torture. Now, him having the ability to jump in and out of people's nightmares and force people to sleep, again, we talked about that before. That's due to his exposure from the Lazarus Planet event, which is to say, quite literally, this giant volcanic explosion with chemicals from the Lazarus pit that normally resurrects people, and in turn, it started giving people powers. With Lucas himself, it granted him the ability to jump in and out of people's nightmares, much like Freddy Krueger, and even put people into an almost permanent sleep. And so what's so interesting here is that Deadman, in possession of the Nightmare Stone, leaves the body of Bruce Wayne and then jumps into the mind of Christopher Lucas in order to use the Nightmare Stone against him, but we also get the full totality of his origin. And what we end up finding out here is that Christopher Lucas was at one point a huge fan of the Justice League. And that makes sense given the fact that he was in Gotham, given the fact that he is, or at least like anybody on Earth, champions the Justice League as superheroes and so on. And so like even his son is wearing like a Flash shirt, right? That kind of thing. And so what he does when he gets in is he tells his family, well, you know, the Justice League is downtown fighting a monster and they said everybody needs to evacuate, but I know the Justice League will save us. And then like the whole place implodes, right? It's just like, boom, like the whole place crashes in, his entire family is killed. And like, that's what drove him insane. That's the thing that broke him, right? Because he wanted the Justice League to come there and save him, but ultimately they didn't. And that's when he manifests as Insomnia, right? The God of Nightmares. And it's just like, this is what I dream about, right? When I close my eyes, this is what I saw. This is what drove me insane in the first place. It's why I never wanted to sleep. Now, what's so interesting is this whole event, right? This massive chaotic moment, that was during the Dark Knight's Metal event, right? Like that was during the point when the Justice League were fighting evil Batman, right? All those evil versions of Batman, Red Death, Batman Who Laughs, so on and so forth. It was cool. It was this really, really amazing moment, a really amazing line of Batman stories, but that calamity is what cost him his family. But something that I would argue here, right? Something that I would argue here, and you probably picked it up. Sure, blaming the Justice League, they're the reason why all of this happened, right? They're the reason why his family's dead and they were never saved, all that kind of stuff. This is all rooted in guilt because they were warned to evacuate. And they didn't. They stayed and they died, right? His whole family died. So on some level, at the very core level of all of this, is Christopher Lucas who's not angry at the Justice League. He's angry at himself because he knows he should have gotten his family out of there. He didn't. And you could argue he's the one that got his family killed. So again, it's really interesting in the sense that it's really just very much unspoken. But the reality here is his hatred for the Justice League is so extreme that he wants the world to see the Justice League the way he sees them. He wants the world to hate the Justice League, to despise the Justice League, because they're not heroes who save the world from danger. They're heroes who create danger. Now, if any of you guys have been reading DC Comics for really since Infinite Crisis, you've heard this before. That was the stance of Superboy Prime. Superheroes are not superheroes anymore. They're anti-heroes. The line between the good guy and the bad guy is incredibly blurred. And that's been an on-running theme in DC Comics for a couple decades. Do superheroes save the world from threats, or do superheroes create the threats that they save the world from, right? Is that how this works? Just by virtue of their actions, are they creating more problems than they're stopping? And so what the God of Nightmares says is he says like, yeah, I don't want to kill the Justice League. The death of my family was my nightmare, so I thought I would return the favor. The little clues that I've shown you along the way, the little bits and pieces, that was all part of a much bigger game. I wanted you to bring the Nightmare Stone here. I wanted you to show me this Nightmare Stone. I wanted to see that you actually have it. And what he does is he says, did you forget the rules that were established when this whole thing kicked off? If you die in your nightmares, you die in real life. And in that moment, he seizes the Nightmare Stone and even kills his own physical form. And what it does is it basically allows his spiritual essence, really the nightmare version of himself, to manifest in the real world. He could have done this at any point in time, but it was waiting on the arrival of the Nightmare Stone in order to do it. Now that he has it in his possession, everybody starts waking up, right? Joker wakes up, and Nightwing wakes up, and Flash wakes up. All those guys from those horrible ass tie-in comics, they all wake up, right? They all just start snapping too. Even Boston Brand is no longer in the body of Batman, and Batman wakes up. This is where the end of the Batman tie-in issues that we covered, this is where that picks up, right? Where he wakes up and Damian says, this is the real world and we lost, right? That kind of thing. This is where that happens. And so ultimately, in possession of the Nightmare Stone, what the God of Nightmares is able to do is bring all of his nightmares, everybody's nightmares, into the real and tangible world. This guy takes over reality. If you have seen it as a nightmare in your dream, it will manifest in the real world. It's amazing. Of course, we do get the evil version of the Justice League, which you would expect to happen out of that, but it's dope, which is cool because finally this story is starting to get awesome. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end. If you need to get caught up on Night Terrors, make sure you click this link to the playlist, and I will catch you all later. Peace. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with Night Terrors, and I'm curious to see how you guys feel about the ending of this because it's a little wonky. So what this does is this initially opens up with a young girl who basically wakes up from a dream. And for those of you guys who are just joining us, the long and short of Night Terrors is that there is a guy named Insomnia whose family died during a fight between these evil version of Batman, basically, and the Justice League, right? The building collapsed and they were killed and so on and so forth. Because of that, he took what was previously called the Dream Stone, which allowed a person to manipulate reality by bringing their dreams into the real world, and then in turn, once it had become the Nightmare Stone, used it for his own ends. And we'll kind of talk a little bit more about that as we get further through this story. But with this girl waking up after the entire world had been put to sleep, initially her nightmares are kind of dismissed by her parents, right? When she talks about like the evil Justice League and so on and so forth. But then she refers to the man with no eyelids, who of course we know is Insomnia. Her parents saw the exact same guy. That of course is also dismissed to a degree, but then we suddenly have this moment where these kind of nightmare members of the Justice League are yanked into the real world by Insomnia himself. And so following that, the rest of the Justice League responds exactly as you would expect them to. And it's not even just the Justice League. It's the Justice League and like a whole host of heroes, which also includes Sandman. Now, again, I called it before that as soon as they brought Sandman back, right, as soon as Wesley Dodge showed back up, I was like, okay, they're gonna basically find a way to bring him back. And that is in effect what they are going to do, although you'll see as we get further through this seemingly exactly how they're gonna do it. But Insomnia making his move, he actually ends up using Boston Brand. And what he does is he kind of talks about this idea that Boston Brand himself is kind of the guy that made all this possible. And in reality, it's true. It was never the intention of Deadman to do that, right? The intention of Deadman was to possess Batman and then eventually enter into the mind of Insomnia and then basically try to find a way to defeat him. But by bringing the Nightmare Stone directly to him, he literally gave him exactly what he was looking for. It was just one gigantic ruse. And so what he does, sort of toying with Boston Brand, is says, look, this all went according to plan. You made all this happen. Let me give you your just reward. And what he ends up doing is he actually ends up presenting Boston Brand with his own family after kind of putting him into a bit of a trance, possibly even sleeping. Technically, Boston Brand is dead, so he doesn't really sleep. But the fact remains that he's sort of brought in by this whole thing, kind of hoodwinked, right? By like this family that he imagines himself having some measure of normalcy in this life that is otherwise abnormal. And what I mean by that is when it comes to Boston Brand, and we haven't really talked about him too much, he is quite literally a dead guy, right? He's basically a ghost, and he's kind of doomed to seemingly spend eternity just watching these individuals living their lives, but never actually being able to join their lives at all. So it is a really interesting role, possibly curse. I guess it really depends on how you look at it. But the one thing he's always longed for is a family of his own. And he basically gets it. And so it kind of takes him out of commission for a temporary period of time. Now, following that, the rest of the Justice League basically responds with Deadman out of the equation and tries to defeat him like where they can, when they can, but there's not a whole lot they can do here, right? Now, one of the things that I also want to draw your attention to, this is written by some top-notch writers over at DC Comics, right? Chip Zdarsky, Matt Rosenberg, and so on, but it doesn't feel like it, right? Because it's one of these things where it's kind of written almost like a campy 1960s type of story, which I guess maybe it's been this way up to this point, but it just kind of feels more noticeable now than it has in the past. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter, right? The Justice League cannot overtake this guy. They can't beat this guy as easily as they had hoped. And so it's one of these things where he even makes a kind of mockery of like the Hall of Heroes, right? Like, you guys keep trophies from your accomplishments from the various villains that you've defeated. What kind of heroes need trophies, right? Let me present you with my trophies, and then forces them to fight their own nightmarish versions of themselves. Now, one of the things that I do want to specify here is that these nightmarish versions have appeared in their own individual dreams, but they are basically opposites, right? Caricatures of their actual selves. And so it's interesting to see the Justice League fighting kind of like their evil counterparts, if you want to call it that. But even when you have Wesley Dodds trying to wake up Boston Brand from this kind of trance type experience, eventually he does, right? He starts to realize this whole thing is a nightmare, none of it's real, and basically starts to move away from it, and then immediately goes after Insomnia. And in fact, he almost kind of leans into his punishment, right? Even going so far as to say, I gave up on that kind of life a long time ago, long before I died, in fact. And so in that moment, Boston Brand is like seized by insomnia and forced to kind of experience this sort of horrendous life that he lives, right? He says, this is you alone. I see you were already living your nightmare. Before, you always craved the spotlight, and that was taken along with your life. So you've been trapped as this audience, forced to watch others live, never able to move on. And the response of Boston is, if I'm trapped here, then I'll make sure you're trapped with me. And so this is a very important moment, because now the fight suddenly just takes place between Insomnia and Boston Brand. We don't really see a whole lot of it. Instead, you just kind of transition to the various superheroes who are facing off against their evil demonic selves. I mean, there's not really a whole lot doing here. It's kind of interesting a little bit, but not really overly important. But between Boston Brand and Insomnia, this is interesting, because Boston's response is like, you're letting the Nightmare Stone corrupt you. It called for you. It wanted you to free it. I felt it too. It played on my anger left over from when I died. But the response of Insomnia is, but what did you lose? Your life, the spotlight, that's it. I lost everything. Now, something that I want to specify here, and this is what's really interesting when it comes to the different perceptions of Boston Brand and Insomnia, it's a matter of priorities. It's a matter of significance. What matters the most? In the mind of Insomnia, the most important thing that he had was his family, right? It was his wife and it was his two kids. They were everything, right? And like any father who's any measure of a father, he would willingly give his life for his family in order to keep them safe. I can't imagine any kind of a father and husband who wouldn't do that. But for Boston Brand, it was really just kind of him living his life with a goal out there that was never ever achieved, right? Unfinished business, if we want to reference the Casper film from back in the 1990s. But the important distinction here is that each of these guys views their own individual life or their own individual loss as a seemingly important thing. And they're trying to make comparisons, right? They're kind of trying to equal these two things out, right? Like, this is equal to this, and so on and so forth, but it's all a matter of perception, right? They're literally fighting over who's struggled the most. And so the response of Deadman is, nothing is going to bring your family back, Insomnia. This does not honor them. Please, let's stop this together. And Insomnia's response is, you're right. The world knows the truth now. I won, but that's not enough. The Justice League could have saved my family and they didn't. I know how to honor my family. I punish the heroes. And so what you end up getting is the Justice League that transitions to Arkham, where they basically pick up with John Dee. Now, John Dee's a character that has been referenced heavily over the course of this story, but he's also incredibly obscure unless you're like a super hardcore DC Comics fan. So the idea behind John Dee is this is basically Dr. Destiny. And Dr. Destiny was a guy who had come into possession of the Dreamstone at some point along the line and then had corrupted it and turned it into the Nightmare Stone. but he was fearful of what it was capable of, and that's why he hid it. Because if a person were able to attain the Nightmare Stone and use it for their own ends, you'd see exactly what you're seeing now. This person using the nightmares of the world and bringing them into reality. It's horrifying, right? Just because of the pure imagination that takes place in our subconscious when we're dreaming, right? It's 100% pure, unadulterated imagination. That's it. We can't even control it, right? So if your subconscious just kind of dreams these wild and crazy concepts up, and somebody in possession of the Nightmare Stone decides to bring those things into reality, that could lead to the destruction of anything and everything. And in fact, it could even lead to the destruction of all reality. So it's no small wonder why this guy got rid of this thing, right? Tried to hide it between realities in a place that nobody could access. And so what you end up having is Batman presenting this to Wesley Dodds, who decides to take it, right? He says, allow me. I always felt a connection to it. I always dreamed of being part of something bigger. Now that's an important bit of Sandman's history, right? Wesley Dodds was always the guy who wanted to be a part of like the greater superhero community. He never really was, right? But even beyond the superhero community itself, ever since his first encounter with Dream of the Endless, he always kind of wanted to walk among the gods. So even when he was part of the Justice Society of America, he was a person who was able to contribute to the team, but he was never really a powered being in the sense that he wasn't really powered like the original Green Lantern Alan Scott, right? Or the original Flash Jay Garrick, or Dr. Fate, or somebody along those lines. But even in the midst of all of this, try as they might, they all find themselves corrupted by the power of insomnia. Because it says, you think you can handle the Dreamstone's power, Wesley Dodds? You're nothing but some old zombie. You're out of your league. Now the whole world sees the heroes, like I do, as monsters. And there's a bit of bickering back and forth between the two of them, but Wesley Dodds makes this really good case where he says that Nightmare Stone should never be in the real world, Insomnia, and that where Insomnia himself responds by saying like, give it to me or I'll kill you like I killed Deadman. Of course, we end up finding out that Deadman is actually alive, right? He just kind of faked his death. It was a great big huge ruse, that kind of thing. And he ends up seizing control of Insomnia himself and basically dragging him back into arguably the nightmare realm, the afterlife, whatever you want to call it. And it's a bit murky here because technically Insomnia is not dead, right? He's not a guy who is deceased. He's a living person who effectively augmented himself using a combination of the powers that he got from the whole Lazarus Planet event when he was doused with the Lazarus Pit chemicals and gained abilities, along with what he's now doing, which is the Nightmare Stone. But by seizing him, Boston Brand kind of throws him into this realm, and then Boston Brand enters as well. And it really gives the implication that he's going on to the afterlife. He says, it's time I went on a new adventure, Wesley. My deal with Ramakrishna was over lifetimes ago. For those of you guys who don't know what that means, when Boston Brand was killed, right, because he was literally murdered, he ended up striking a deal with Ramakrishna, who's a character that's part of like the John Constantine, Zatanna mythos in DC, right, like all that kind of magic and mysticism, and that she would give him the ability to basically achieve his revenge. He did, but then he's also kind of lingered ever since. And so that's what he's referencing, right? He says, I'm sick of being in the audience, no more watching the living. I need to be the star again. Don't you hear it? They're cheering for me. And so it's almost like he kind of dies, right? Now, Insomnia himself falls into what really is his own nightmare, although arguably you could say he basically ends up falling into hell. But he wakes up surrounded by his family, right? The people that he misses the most, only for them to turn into kind of like their nightmare selves, to start chewing on him, consuming him, so on and so forth. Then you get like flames, fire, and all that kind of good stuff. So it really looks like he was just taken to hell by Deadman, and he's just going to spend eternity there. Because for those of you guys who aren't familiar with that, heaven and hell do exist in DC Comics. That is a part of their mythos. The Judeo-Christian philosophy of like the afterlife, that's a very big part of like the whole entire other side of the superhero landscape in DC. But following that, for Wesley Dodds, the question's asked by Zatanna whether or not he's ready to basically go back to his life, right? Or really go back to being dead, right? His mission's more or less quote unquote done. And so of course you have her kind of casting the spell, rest in peace. And then he basically goes back back to slumbering. And then of course, Batman passes out because Deadman had basically pushed his body to the brink by keeping him not really awake, but by keeping his body from being able to rest the way it normally does when we're sleeping. No one really knows when he's going to recover, so that's going to kind of feed into the Batman stories. Maybe Damian Wayne will end up becoming Batman and instead, not entirely sure. But for Sandman Wesley, this is where things get interesting, because I think this story in a lot of ways will draw interest to his character where it didn't previously exist. Whether or not that would see a successful solo series, I'm not entirely sure, but apparently he's getting one. So I will go so far as to argue that Sandman solo series is just going to be like the lost tales of Wesley Dodds, things that he was doing before he died. And if that proves to be popular, DC's going to be like, and he's back through like whatever means, comic book logic, and that's basically it. But the bigger conversation here takes place between like Mr. Terrific, Wonder Woman, and Superman, where they talk about how like the day saved, Insomnia has been defeated, but everything feels so wrong. And the statement of Wonder Woman is, it's because we didn't win today, right? Insomnia did, because he got exactly what he wanted. People are now terrified of the Justice League. This little girl that we talked about at the beginning of the story starts taking down these little drawings that she had made for the Justice League of America, these heroes that she kind of idolized. She more or less sees them as horrifying things. People have lost faith in them. Now, this is when the ending of the story gets what we in the comic book scene refer to as goofy. So what this does is it transitions over to Amanda Waller. That's not the goofy part. Amanda Waller's amazing, right? Amanda Waller's just absolutely awesome. But what she talks about is that like the tide's turning, right? That like society is kind of turning against the Justice League of America. And she talks about how Insomnia had actually given two gifts. The first was the Helmet of Hate on Lazarus Island, the ability to channel the hate of various people who were out there. And then of course, the Nightmare Stone, which was stolen during all the chaos and all the pandemonium. But somebody out there whose identity is a total mystery basically talks about how they want to use these things, right? This person says, I need to see that they can't just use smiles to solve all our problems. That's not real, right? That's like the only real motivation that we get. So Amanda Waller hands the helmet and the Nightmare Stone over to this person who fuses the two of them together and then refers to themselves as Dr. Hate. The outfit and everything looks pretty dope, but the whole thing feels kind of dumb. So I'm sort of curious to see where DC goes with it. But with that being said, guys, let me know down in the comments how you feel about this story. I feel like I already know what you guys are going to say. If you want to get caught up on Night Terrors, make sure you click this link to the playlist, and I will catch you all later. Peace.